Welcome again, everybody, to the Fawn Pod, the Fawncast. It's friends occasionally not disagreeing, except this time it's spooky, not disagreeing.
Ooh.
Yes. You know what that means. Our favorite season is almost upon us. Election season and primaries.
That is pretty scary.
It is quite scary, but no, actually, we're getting back into Spooktober. Who's
Ooh.
excited? Who knew we'd still be on the air a year later to get back to this? Wow. Kind of
It's almost
remarkable.
like it's almost like we've unleashed some sort of curse onto the
Oh.
unsuspecting general public.
I see what you did there.
Yeah.
Well. As we are rolling the calendar here over to October, I know our only two hosts tonight, myself and Justin. This is one of
Hello.
the favorite times of the year for both of us for similar and different reasons at the same time.
Yeah.
So, Justin, do you have any plans for this October in
Uh,
terms of media consumption or other things?
well, the other things is nice and simple. I mean, there's always the Halloween party that you host every year, and I'm very much looking forward to that because
Oh,
it's
yes, that's fully
always
ready.
but yeah, it's always a good time. I never quite know what to expect, but it's always fun. Um, Otherwise, to try and get myself in the holiday spirit, so to speak, I've been digging through my Steam backlog, in addition to working my way gradually through Baldur's Gate 3. But I've been trying to dredge up some of the horror games I haven't played yet. I just finished one called Decarnation, which it's listed as horror, and I think like psychological horror on the Steam page, but I don't know if I agree with that. It's as much horror as like Silence of the Lambs is horror. So it's much more of a thriller mind game kind of thing with some uh there is some like grotesque imagery and stuff, but a lot of that is sort of hallucinatory. So
Okay.
yeah, I don't know if I'd call it horror, but it was a good game. Fantastic soundtrack. Some of it was done by Akira Yamaoka of Silent Hill fame, but a lot of it was done by a band who, as far as I can tell, their only credit is the soundtrack. The soundtrack for this game, called Le Fleur et Bleu, I think. It's set in Paris, so
Okay.
French band, and it actually really good music. And the plot, without going too much into detail, is you play as like an aging dancer whose life is falling apart and ends up basically getting kidnapped by someone who is more or less her quote unquote greatest fan, and things get really uncomfortable and weird. And like I said, interesting game. I wouldn't really call it horror, but it's not a bad start to spooky season.
Yeah.
Um,
Nice.
yeah. What about you?
Um, yeah, most of my time, what little I'm having here is probably Halloween party, though I am working on that far less than I probably should at this point, but I did get a decent head start on it in like August, so I'm hoping I can kind of ride what I have done in that for a little while till I get caught up on some other times. Um, but beyond that, I mean, we mentioned, without dropping any names here, there were some other little indie video games out there that kind of looked intriguing to me. I usually try to play something scary-ish around this time of the year if something fits in, and I usually get in a movie or two as well, I would say. But I'm just a big fan of this time of the year with the weather getting a little bit colder and the leaves starting to fall and Halloween coming up especially. Um, and the party, of course, is a highlight just to see everybody again and kind of hope that my work has paid off for another year. So that's something to look forward to as well. And yeah, I don't know what else. I mean, depending on when I go to it, there is one non-spooky season thing that I have maybe in the cards, which is I might go to Chicago one of these next weekends here, perhaps, to go see a play based on the gods and goddesses of the Aztecs,
Ooh.
set in a fictitious wrestling promotion. So there is a play called Lucha Teal, and it is playing in Chicago, and it's basically the setup. It's a stage play, not a wrestling show. It is a stage play, but it does have quote unquote matches that take place as part of the story, and a ring on the stage. So I might take the kids and go to that. Sounds intriguing.
That
They had a
sounds
run.
incredible.
Yeah, they had a run in Dallas, I guess, like 5 or 6 years ago, and now it's here in Chicago. It's back. So
Cool.
yeah, that's kind of something. If I can get to that, that looks fun too. So, but what else? Yeah, I guess that's about it. Well, we'll jump into this today since again it's just the two of us here, so we have nobody to make fun of tonight. But anyway, so our subject tonight, when thinking of an idea here for how to kick off Spooktober this year, last year we looked at movies and video games, and I think we did the Jersey Devil that week I just saw. And there
I think so.
might have been a fourth one we did in there as well, but we were looking for something different for this year, and I brainstormed the idea of curses, with really no context beyond that, just curses. And Justin took the bait on this one, like I figured he would. Nobody else joined us on this one tonight, so it's, again, here just the two of us. But curses are kind of an interesting phenomenon slash belief system. And I guess just for starters here, I was thinking of a little intro that included just thoughts on curses in general here, whether that is apparently, let's go back a step here. So apparently, historically, this is what I could find at least, the noun verse of a curse, not the verb of cursing someone, I guess, but the actual thing itself, they can trace back to late Old English from the word curse, C-U-R-S, which is a prayer that evil or harm befall on one, consignment of a person to an evil fate, but they're not sure where the word came from before that per se. It does say that there is no similar word in the Germanic language tree, nor the Romance language tree, nor Celtic. There is a Latin word, cursus, which essentially means course, Course, which originally meant the Christian set of daily prayers that they would do. So they're thinking this was kind of like the perversion of that, more or less praying for someone to, have something bad happen to them, as opposed to maybe a different version of that. You might say a church, in other words. So that's kind of the earlier part I have found on this, but it's interesting in that it has kind of both a religious connotation as well as, from what I could see, the idea of cursing someone does really seems to be a pervasive worldwide phenomenon. Like I could find traces of it in Japan and Africa and definitely in North America, but this is kind of a worldwide idea of like just putting, bad juju on somebody, if you will, and hoping that something happens to them. So, and then I think maybe more in today's world, we might use it in more of a I don't know, like almost like a way to not accept fate for something that's happened to you. Like, oh, I was cursed, or, we have curse words, which are like swear words, or we have, kind of the idea of like cursing someone else, but maybe not in the same context that we would have 500 years ago, when you were really cursing someone. So, so Justin, when did you first get involved with curses?
Well, it's when I went to that damn liberal college. Uh, no, curses as a phenomenon, as like a plot element, if nothing else, have always been kind of interesting to me because unlike monsters, unlike ghosts, unlike anything tangible or that you can point to and say, okay, there's the thing we need to be afraid of. Curses are a lot more ephemeral. Because there's usually not, or oftentimes there's not even like a physical object you can point to say that, okay, that's the origin of what's causing all this bad karma to happen. Sometimes there is like, I'm blanking on what they're called. I think they might be called Ningyo, but they're Japanese straw dolls that can be nailed to a tree. That's a very physical thing, where the curses are poured into those, and then they it's sort of like in a voodoo doll sense. They get passed on to whoever the target is. But there's other things that are a lot more, that are a lot harder to pin down. And just the sheer variety and scope of what a curse can entail, it's just really interesting to me. Because yes, it is a play on superstition a lot of the time in terms of like, oh, yeah, I'm having bad luck, it must be cursed, yeah, that sort of thing. But from a storytelling standpoint, a curse can be almost anything and originate from almost anywhere. And sometimes it's not even a conscious act that brings a curse about. And the sheer variety there just really is a font of inspiration, or maybe not inspiration, but creativity at least, and just
Inspiration.
food for
I
thought.
saw a slip in there. Hey, why does that look like me? Wait a second.
But yeah, it's just they're really interesting because you never quite know what form they're going to take, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah, we should also say in at least researching this, I was one that was kind of dragging a little behind on catching up on research for this episode. Justin had a little head start on me here, but one thing that really struck me just in attempting to look for curses online is there were far less listed than I would have guessed based on just the terminology of a curse, and B, I felt like I really had to wade in the differences of curse versus cursed versus hauntings versus death, because a lot of times it seemed like they were just like, this place is haunted, it's cursed. And was like, well, maybe, but not necessarily. And I tried to focus more on, but I'll admit I failed with some of these, as you'll see, but I tried to focus more on ones that at least had a source that said like someone had cursed the object or the place or the, whatever it was, rather than just like, oh, this place is cursed because it's got no popcorn after 8 o'clock. So, I like when the origin of these stories is like I don't want to say truthful or tangible, but definitely like there's at least a report of like, and they cursed the people from there on out to live forever their lives and whatever. But
Whereas interestingly, I kind of take the opposite approach, where if there is no explanation, like nothing tangible, that strikes me as kind of even more intriguing. Because it's like there's just something bad about this area or this object, and no one's entirely sure why, but it just messes people up when they get involved with it.
yeah.
And that element of mystery is really neat, I think.
All right. Well, I'm excited to. I saw a couple of your topics title wise poking around for stuff, but I haven't looked into any of yours, I don't believe. So this will be fun to see what you have.
Okay.
And I know you don't know all those things I have on here either, but
Okay.
it seems weird to do honorable mentions on this, but I did have two curses I wanted to ever so briefly mention before we get into our list that we both made tonight. One is, of course, well, these are both from the sports world, which is not typically something that pops up frequently on our podcast, save for a solo episode. Maybe I do on wrestling here or there or something. But baseball fans in particular here in Chicago would know the curse of the GOAT, but this is the curse that, of course, I chose is the curse of the Bambino for the Boston Red Sox, who legendarily sold Babe Ruth to their rival New York Yankees after winning 4 World Series and having Babe Ruth on the payroll. And they sold him off to the Yankees to finance the famous play, what is it, No No Nanette, I believe. And if you haven't heard of that, it's because it stunk. It went nowhere. They sold off one of the best players of all time to finance a play that opened 5 years later and was not well received. And supposedly this cursed the Red Sox from 1918. I think they sold them in 1920, technically, all the way till they won their next championship in 2004. So 80 some years went by, including a terrible string of bad luck of balls hit between players' legs and random balls that hit a young rookie in the eye and like ended his career right away, to walk-off home runs by the other team later on, game sevens that just went south. All these terrible things that happened until finally 2004, down again 3-0 to the New York Yankees. They became the first, I think at that time, the first pro sports team. I think hockey's had a team since then, I know. Basketball may have also, to come back from 3 games down to win 4 in a row. And that was fantastic. So, and now they're winners every so often, but there we go. So that's a quick one, just the curse of the Bambino, supposedly. And then the other one here, just to spend a second more on, is one that blends video games and football. And this is, of course, the famous John Madden curse from the Madden video games. And I happen to find a nice article here on CBS from just this year, 2023. And apparently this is the 25-year anniversary, or maybe 26 years. The 26th game might have just came out. But they have quite a, due to the lineage of this, they have quite a resource pool they can look back from and take a peek here. So if you're not familiar with this somehow, the basic concept here is Madden's one of the biggest selling football games. It was one of several back in the day, but now it's kind of the biggest one. And they would always choose, a big athlete at the time to be on the cover of the game, essentially to sell copies of it or be the poster boy or whatever. And they quickly found after a few years, when someone noticed that, well, if you were on the cover of a Madden game, your future may not have been as bright as you would have hoped. But you don't have to take my word for it. 2000 edition, John Madden football, we have running back Barry Sanders from the Detroit Lions, who retires in between the game coming out and the end of the season. So after he was on the cover, he never actually even played again. His career was over in a very shocking departure. And CBS has rated this one cursed. 2001, a running back, Eddie George, who was fantastic, except till he was on the cover of this, at which time he lost the season-ending playoff game and never was another star for the rest of his career. 2002, verdict cursed. 2002, Dante Culpepper, quarterback for the Vikings, who was fantastic before that, after this cover appearance, had 16 fumbles, 14 touchdowns, but 13 interceptions, and went 4-7 after his cover time. Cursed. Next up is running back Marshall Faulk, who had fantastic seasons. After his cover on Madden, broke down, missed half a dozen games, and was never a star again. Cursed. 2004, Michael Vick. We'll leave the dog fighting thing out of this. Yeah. Anyway, cover boy, after that, less than a week after the game comes out, breaks his fibula. He's out. 4 years later, he's in jail, unrelated. Cursed. 2005, another quarterback. Let's see here. Looks pretty good, except this one they labeled as not cursed. He had a decent year this year. This is Ray Lewis, linebacker. They said he had a decent year, except he still missed 10 games, apparently, even with a good year that year. So, 2006 quarterback Donovan McNabb, who was pretty good again for a couple years here. And then after he was cover boy, he lost a 6-10 season and then lost another 8 games being injured over the next 2 seasons as well, never achieving fame again. Cursed. 2007, who can forget famous running back Sean Alexander, who had 5 straight 1,000-yard seasons and is fantastic, except after he was the cover boy, his carries dropped down to less than 1,000, and within 2 years, he was not only not on the team, he was completely out of football professionally. Cursed. 2008, quarterback Vince Young, just terrible. 17 interceptions the next year. He earned a seat on the bench for most of the next season and never regained the coach's trust. Cursed. 2009, hey, Brett Favre. People heard of him before. After he was the cover boy, all he did was set an NFL record with 22 interceptions and then blew out his shoulder. Cursed. 2010, we have 2 people on the cover. They broke tradition here. Wide receiver Larry Fitzgerald and safety Troy Polamalu. Fitz had a pretty good year that year, but Polamalu missed 11 games because he, you guessed it, blew his MCL that year. Cursed, or at least half cursed. 2011 quarterback Drew Brees, Hall of Famer. Here we go. 33 touchdowns the year before. Except on this one, he went 7-9 and lost. He lost to a losing team in the playoffs that year, who were 7-9, and also threw 22 interceptions, a career high and franchise record for the Saints. Cursed. 2012, Peyton Hillis. I don't even know who this is. Running back, a Madden cult hero. Let's see here. Had 1,000 yards. He came back for a half dozen games. He missed over a half dozen games with injury and could not carry the ball for very far. He was never a starter again in his career. Cursed. 2013, Lions wide receiver, Calvin Johnson. Here's a Michigan guy for you, Justin. Had a historic and career season the year he was on the cover. But the year he was on Madden, wait, curveball, actually had almost 2,000 yards. This might be the first guy that really broke away from the curse. He did retire a few years after that, but they label him as not cursed. Continuing on here, 2014, we have running back Adrian Peterson, who has 6 1,000-yard seasons in a row. He actually missed the entire next season after being indicted on child abuse charges. Next up, cursed. Richard Sherman, cornerback for the Seahawks here, still did pretty well. Not cursed. 2015, 2016, Odell Beckham Jr., not fantastic, not his best year, but still did well with 1,400 yards. Not cursed. 2017, Rob Gronkowski for the Patriots. Missed all of the Patriots' first 4 games with a hamstring and then ended up finishing with just 6 starts because of a herniated disc. Cursed. 2018, need we say the words, Tom Brady. Oh my gosh. No, he was fine. I'm just kidding. He still won an MVP even at age 40. He says he's immune to the curse. So Brady is not immune to, or is immune to the Madden curse, but Madden is not immune to the Brady curse, apparently. So 2019, Antonio Brown from the Steelers, wide receiver. Let's see here. Yes. Well, where do we get into this? Previous year had career high 15 touchdowns, but has problems in the locker room after his cover appearance. He's traded to the Raiders. He plays 1 more season and only 16 more games in the entire NFL career because he bounces around 3 different teams with all sorts of problems on and off the field. Cursed. 2020, we have Patrick Mahomes. Yes, he still won the Super Bowl. Fine, not cursed. 2021, Lamar Jackson from the Ravens, not cursed as well. And then 2022, what kind of chicanery is this? They put Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes both on the cover. And, well, that was good years for both of them. So there we go. 2023 edition, they put John Madden himself on the cover as the 25th anniversary edition. Of course, he had been dead for 2 years before that, so hard to curse him at that point. All right. And then current, we have quarterback Josh Allen of the Bills, who is the current Madden athlete. We will see what happens with him. So using CBS's rating criteria, they labeled 14 and a half of the 24 cover athletes as cursed, but just 3 from the last 10. So maybe the curse is waning, or maybe it's over, or maybe there never was a curse. But this one, like some other ones on my list tonight, made me think a little bit, which is you can read into things the way you want to, right? Especially when it comes to curses, especially with no story. Like there's no report here of anybody having cursed the Madden franchise. It was merely that they appeared on the cover and then had a bad year. And these are pro sports athletes. So of course there's going to be years that you're hurt. Of course there's going to be, time missed for different reasons, but I would still say that's an uncannily high number. 60% of these mega famous superstars whose career went in the shitter, after being on the cover of Madden. That's still a little surprise because you wouldn't think that many of them would taper off that quickly.
In general, yes, but there is also the, I guess you could say, psychological factor to think about here, where so consider you get the call, like you're at the top of your game, you've never been better, and all of a sudden you get the call, you're going to be on the cover of Madden, like one of the top selling games, consistently of all time.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, yeah, that's great. You go for the photo shoot or whatever, and then you go back to playing, and that's a lot of pressure to live up to. In the back of your mind, you're like, oh man, everyone's going to be seeing my face on this. I mean, they see me anyway, but this is, now I'm, I'm there front and center on something that sells millions and millions of copies. And if you know about the curse, then you have that hanging over your head too. Like, oh, all these other people have had, real dips in their career. They've just crashed and burned. I can't let that happen to me. And there's a good chance, I think, that these guys might just be putting too much pressure on themselves, trying to overachieve even beyond what they already are when they're at their peak. And then that causes them to, push themselves too hard, get injured, or, they psych themselves out and they start, dropping the ball, missing plays. And once you have that initial stumble in sports, in your job, in anything, it can be really hard to pick yourself back up and turn that around, especially if that stumble happened when you were as good as you had been up until that point. Because then all of a sudden you've got people saying, "Oh no, is this the end for so and so?
Yeah.
Is it? Are their best days behind them? Yeah, that sort of thing." And so all these things can factor in and really wreak havoc on a person's mindset. So I think a lot of it could be psychological.
That's a good
And
point too, because a lot of these people probably were chosen after they had a career year or were at the peak of their career. So
mhm. Yeah, and it's a matter of, there's the law of averages too, where the hot streak can't last forever. So eventually things are going to balance out. The extent that, things shift and they really take a nosedive, that's pretty profound, but you're not going to have record years over and over and over again. And I do think that yeah, that's a big factor. It's timing, it's psychology, and it's at times people being their own worst enemies. So,
yeah, it's interesting. I was just checking here too. There are definite reports out there. If you are listening audience and you want to check out, there have been numerous high profile football players who have rejected being the Madden cover as well. Now, whether that is because of the curse or because of, I'm just reading here, seems to be some dispute actually. This one thing I'm reading on Wired said cover athletes made between 100,000 and 200,000 to be the cover athlete, but also were required to do multiple appearances along with all the publicity for the game being launched. So maybe there's some with that. Now, later on, I found a different article that said the NFL Players Union claims the players do not actually get paid to do this. So I
oh,
don't know what the real story is with that, but it definitely is a history here. As well as I see there are some YouTube videos called Rejected Cover Athletes that you can check out, which I assume would be people who just did not want to be on the cover. I haven't clicked those, but there's that. So, yeah, so those are my quick two sports honorable mentions for curses today, if there is such a thing there. And then the rest of these we'll get into. Well, one's not as sinister yet, but the other ones are pretty fun. So let's get to the big show here. Justin, you want me to go first with my first one, or would you like to go first with your first one? I'll leave it up to you.
I can go first, I guess.
Okay.
So I'm going to approach mine just in terms of chronology. The most
Hmm.
venerable, the oldest ones up until the most recent. And I tried to do a decent variety here. But to start with, I would be remiss in an episode about curses not to mention Pele's curse from Hawaii. My wife was born in Hawaii. She's very familiar with how this whole thing is supposed to work.
I don't think I knew
Uh,
that. Really? I didn't think I knew that.
yeah, yeah. She was a
Interesting.
military kid, so
Wait, does she have dual
kind of.
citizenship? Ah, you thought about that for a second.
I see what you did there. Um, but yeah, she knows about this and she does take it seriously to the extent that when we went to Iceland, another very volcanically active region, she would not let me take home any sand or any volcanic rocks. Even though it's half a world away, that's how seriously she takes this whole thing.
Okay.
So Pele's curse. The idea behind it is Pele, if you're unfamiliar, is the native Hawaiian volcano goddess. So basically, Hawaii, of course, has a lot of volcanic activity, and there a lot of the beaches are, they are formed from volcanic material, and there's a lot of rocks, a lot of sand, that you can just find and pick up and theoretically take back with you as a souvenir. And I gather a lot of people do this, or have done this, and a lot of the time it seems like it's to their detriment. Relationships fall apart. People lose their jobs. People, become destitute. And the thought is that Pele, the goddess, views anything that comes out of a volcano as her child, basically.
Hmm.
So the rocks, the sand, and if you take one of those off of the island, you're essentially stealing her children. and that incurs her wrath. And so the legend goes, until you return, whatever you've taken, you'll just have misfortune after misfortune after misfortune. Um, I did manage to dig up a couple of letters because the Hawaii Tourism Board, I believe, or the DNR, they get a lot of they get a lot of these sent back, like hundreds, if not thousands, per year,
Oh, wow.
and with letters attached, basically begging them to take them back and put them back on the beach or the side of the volcano wherever they got them. So I'm just going to read a couple of these just to give you an example of what people have said as they've sent these things back and begged for forgiveness from this ancient volcano deity. Uh, Dear Sirs, I am returning 2 samples of lava rock from the Volcanoes National Park. I took them to demonstrate to my classes. Since doing so, I have been in an auto accident, taken 2 severe falls, had my basement flooded, and spent numerous hours in doctors' offices for treatment. Currently, my hand is numb and has been for weeks. I am no longer dubious about Pele's powers. Another one, quote, I took this rock when I visited Hawaii in October 1974. A few months later, I met a man who I eventually married. For the past 16 years, this man has made my life miserable. I am truly sorry for taking the lava rock, and I would like for it to be returned to its place of origin. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these sorts of things. People, as the first one mentioned, getting into accidents or, just losing their livelihoods or, just horrible things happening to and around them. And so the story goes, oftentimes when those are sent back, that's all it takes, and their fortunes at least even out, if not turn around.
Hmm.
And it's a belief that's, depending on who you ask, has either been around for a very long time, or it was invented in the 20th century by either park rangers or bus drivers on the islands. Park rangers, the theory goes, they came up with this because they were tired of people, just taking, bits of the natural scenery home with them, and they were looking for a way to try and stop it. The bus drivers, because lava rock is very brittle, and they were tired of having to like sweep, actual like bits of grits and sand from their buses because people were stuffing these things in their bags. So depending on who you believe, this is either like an ancient, long-lasting established curse, or something the tourism board tried to put into place to stop people from just taking all the natural scenery with them.
I mean,
Um,
that's creative if so.
yeah, yeah. But either way, it seems to have generated a reaction because even when people do ignore the warnings and take stuff home, it seems like they regret it. And it's just interesting to me that across the board, so many people attribute whatever bad's happening to them to a piece of rock that they took from, an island in the middle of the ocean. And this is one of those where there's not a definitive like, oh, so and so cursed this, unless you count a god as a person who would put a curse on something.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just kind of fascinating that something as simple as a rock, of which there are thousands, if not millions, just strewn about, something as simple as that could bring misfortune.
I
So that's my first one.
wonder, I'd be curious to see what percentage of the people that took something knowingly did so with knowledge of this
I would too.
as a curse, because I think that would really change how I, as an outsider, would view this. If it's
Mhm.
posted and then like you're taking it after they've been like, don't do this, then that's interesting. I just think of like how many things I have, when my family and I go someplace, we typically will get a rock or two from wherever it's at, beach in Michigan or, Gulf Coast or wherever we're at.
Sure.
Seattle, we've brought stuff back. Bahamas, we brought stuff back, but we always bring like one or two little things with us back as a little souvenir. And we kind of have a rock collection here. So it's kind of funny to think like, who knows how many stories I may have inadvertently broken and crossed the line with along the way. I don't know. So that's it's an interesting one. Okay. So it's definitely not
Yeah.
about the soccer guy then, you're saying.
No, no. I mean, unless you're talking about the curse where, you say his name 3 times into a mirror in the dark and he shows up behind you and kicks you in the nuts.
That's where the
Uh,
curse originated.
but yeah, different Pele,
Oh
obviously.
yeah. Okay. All right. Sweet. That's a fun one. Well, I'm going to do this one first for mine because it's probably the least seemingly curse-ish, scary, supernaturally of the ones I have here of mine tonight. And this is, of course, it's called a curse, but again, I don't know that it would really be a curse. I guess, well, we'll talk about it. So this one is the famous 27 Club, which is referring to musicians who died at the age of 27. All right. So for
Hmm.
people who may not know about this, essentially we have some pretty famous people who all died at the age of 27. That would be not limited to, but including Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, and there are some other members of the original Rolling Stones on there, and I think there's some others as well that you could add to the list on this. But this is an interesting one because there's this kind of thought of like if you're a musician and right around that age, I don't know that anybody's particularly watching you to see if you're going to make it to 27 or not. But when someone dies at the age of 27, people are definitely quick to jump in and be like, oh, 27 Club struck again. Like the curse got them. And it's interesting too, because I'll talk about more at the end. Like there's certainly a lot of famous people who didn't die at 27. Well, let me bring those in here actually. So people who died even before they were 27. Okay. So keep this as food for thought. These are people that died younger than 27. We had, rapper and R&B singer Aaliyah died when she was only 22. Otis Redding died when he was 26. So almost there. Tupac died when he was 25. Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols died when he was 21. We have Buddy Holly died when he was 22. The Notorious B.I.G. was only 24 when he died, and on and on and on. So there's other people here that died, earlier than that. So what's interesting about this is I found a website on, it's called theconversation.com, and I'll try to share this with you here quickly. They went through and somehow, I'd be really curious how they did this behind the scenes, but apparently a guy did this as like a legit academic research project. And what he did was tracked how long every musician lived until. And then he made a little population pyramid here, kind of showing everybody's, point they died at and then what percentage of people died at each of the age. And they came to the conclusion that apparently 56 is the sweet spot for musicians to die, based on the most. And then if you look around the graph here, a lot of the ages clustered around 56 are about when people died as well, which had me thinking about this one more today. My problem with this so-called research that they've done here is I don't think the media or music fans in general are calling it a curse if, no offense to, I'm sure a lot of these people, but random musician Joe Schmo kicks the bucket at 70 or 20, I don't think people care as much. Like the reason this is the magic number is because of the quality of the people that are there, not the quantity of the people that are there, if that makes sense. So these people died by Brian Jones died of drowning. Jimi Hendrix famously swallowed on his own vomit after he was doing drugs. Janis Joplin, heroin overdose. Jim Morrison, drug-induced heart attack. Kurt Cobain, suicide by gunshot. And Amy Winehouse died of alcohol poisoning. Again, all when they were 27. What I would like to see done on this is if there was a way to like triangulate what they have done for research with fame and somehow measure how famous the people were, then I'd be kind of curious if there is like other ages where multiple famous people died of that same age. And I was not able to really find anything on that. Oh, and then another one, if you're Joe, who's another host here, famous legendary Delta blues singer Robert Johnson, who sold his soul to the devil, also died when he was 27 as well. So there's one more for the list also. So they came up with a whopping 1.3% of musicians die at the age of 27, which, again, doesn't make it look like this is even a trend, much less a curse. But there's a couple other factors at this one I was thinking about. Like, number one, saying that a musician dies in their late 50s, that's not really a stretch. Like, a lot of these people probably had crazy drug and alcohol riddled adventures, and or the life of a musician is not always easy either. Like you're on the road a lot, you spend long hours. This is, what they always say, better to burn out than to fade away, right? That's kind of the saying they say for musicians here. And so when they say 56 had the most people, and around that age group had the most people die, I'm thinking, yeah, they probably just gave out around that time from everything that they were doing. But these other people died tragically early and were all very famous at that same age. So I don't know. This is just kind of an interesting one to me. I don't know that it's a curse per se. People call it a curse. But it's, I don't know. It's probably just because they're so famous, to be quite honest. They all died at the same age, but this is just a fascinating one for me, to think about. Somebody, if you want to go down the morbid path, you can do the like fantasy musician to die at 27 game. Let's all pick 5 people and see who it's going to be. I mean, you could get really dark with this, but I don't know. I don't think really people notice until somebody dies and they are 27 too. So this is kind of a little bit of, feed the hysteria when it fits the narrative type thinking, I think.
Confirmation bias, kind of.
Yeah, good call on that. Yeah. I don't know. Any thoughts on this one?
Um, Stuff involving numbers is always kind of interesting, simply because numbers jump out to people. Like you said, oftentimes when one of these musicians dies, it doesn't necessarily fit the pattern until you realize, oh, they were also 27, and it's just a few commonalities is all it takes for the human brain to pick up on what it sees as a pattern. Whether the pattern is there or not is arguable, debatable. But the human mind is wired that way. You see a few things that seem to kind of cluster together and you pay more attention, even if it is in the end just a coincidence. But it's very hard to kind of shake that connection that you draw once you've drawn it, because it's that whole it's better to think you see a tiger in the bushes and be wrong than to think you don't see one and have one be there. It's just we're set up to recognize patterns for better or worse. So anything involving that kind of grouping that involves a number it should be taken with a grain of salt, I think.
Yeah, that's a fun one.
Yeah.
But again, not as scary as some of the other ones here coming up for Spooktober. So, all right, what's your second one you got?
Okay, this one, I'm not sure I'd call it scary, but it does have a higher body count than the last one I
Okay.
talked about. And I apologize in advance to our listeners if any of you are from Italy or have Italian heritage, because I'm going to do my best to pronounce some of these names, and I'm going to try to do it without slipping into a stereotypical Italian accent. But I make no promises. I'm quite tired, but I'll do my best. So my next one is the story behind the island of Gaiola, excuse me. I'm already screwing up. But this is a small and currently uninhabited island off the coast of Naples. Apparently, it is very picturesque. It has been inhabited over time, in ages past, but due to a string of events, a rather long string of events, it is currently abandoned, despite there still being perfectly livable structures on it. The earliest use for it that I was able to find is that it was the site of a shrine to Venus, the goddess, and it was considered to be a site that promoted safe navigation of the seas and stuff, which is going to be very ironic considering what the things that end up happening here. So the first signs that something wasn't right about this place, let me just say the first person who went missing was a hermit who lived just separated from everyone else on the island, who simply was known as the wizard or Il Mago. It was sometime in the 1800s. I haven't been able to find an exact date, but he kept to himself. He only interacted with the local fishermen on occasion, but otherwise just very much the stereotypical archetypal hermit, which might not make it too surprising that one day he simply disappeared. Whether he fell to his death in the sea, or was killed by one of the other people on the island, or what have you, no one seems to know. But his disappearance was the first. I'm not sure if it's the origin of the curse, but it is the first thing that really went wrong there. Um, so the next prominent resident of the island was named Luigi de Negri. He built a nice expansive villa that I guess is still standing on the island today. But he fell into ruin financially sometime after. So these things can happen. Nothing too outside the ordinary yet. Let's see. Let's fast forward a bit to the 20th century. So 1911. A man by the name of Captain Gaspare Albenga. So he was a sailor, and he was maneuvering his ship around the island. Some people say he was considering purchasing it, or investing in it or something. When his ship crashed and he drowned. That, or he simply disappeared along with his ship. There's no consensus on this, but either way, he was never seen again. A few years later, in the 1920s, a Swiss man actually bought property on the island, a man named Hans Braun. This guy, we know what happened to him, or at least how he ended up. He was murdered, and his body was found wrapped in a rug inside his own house. His widow, then not too much further after that, she drowned in the sea. The next owner, whose name I wasn't able to find, had a heart attack. Someone after him committed suicide after being committed to an insane asylum. But it keeps going. So it is a fairly long string that extends over a good number of years, actually centuries, to be honest. So I mean, there are the standard things of people, falling, being swept out to sea. These things happen on an island. That's not too noteworthy. But fast forward a bit more to the 1960s, where you start to get some more high profile people involved in this, including the head of the Fiat Corporation, the automobile company.
Okay.
A man named Gianni Agnelli. So he ended up purchasing the island, I believe, outright. And well, it didn't go so well for him, because at some point during his ownership of it, he found his son's body under a bridge on the island, apparently dead of suicide. His nephew, who I'm not sure was on the island or not, but he died of cancer at a pretty young age. And he wasn't the only rich guy who ended up owning a piece of the island. John Paul Getty, who was a billionaire in the 70s. He in 1973 was basically blackmailed by the mafia, who kidnapped his grandson, sent him his severed ear in the mail, and extorted him for over $3 million to get the kid back. So it's just tragedy after tragedy surrounding people connected to this place. Currently, as I said, it is abandoned, and it is actually a part of a protected area. I believe it's a protected marine area is what it was referred to, where I was able to find it. And people aren't supposed to go there, but if you swim from the mainland, you can, if you're so inclined, set foot on a place that seems to have a very, very nasty history associated with it.
Wow, so you can actually go there.
You can. I don't know if it's legal,
Okay.
but you can get there if you're brave enough and athletic enough. But that is the story behind Gaiola Island off the coast of Naples.
Nice. I hadn't heard of that one before.
Yeah.
Speaking of things I hadn't heard before, about maybe 10 or 11 years ago, I had a fun opportunity as I was teaching for a student to choose topics, and I had a kid come to me and say they wanted to do this next curse as their topic to write about. I had not heard of this at that point, but This is the story of a haunted doll named Robert. Robert the doll, which I assume you would have heard of this one. Yes, Justin? Yes?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so this is in Florida. It's in Key West. This is a domestic story. And it's just kind of going by a few different articles here, but I liked mostly the one on Atlas Obscura, actually, his entry on this one, which has a lot of good photos. And the caretaker of where he's at now, which I'll get to in a second, does some of the interview here too. So if anybody is quote unquote going to know about this thing, it would be the person who's currently watching him every day. So that's kind of nice as well. I think Annabelle the doll is probably maybe more famous in public consciousness with the movies and The Conjuring and all that type of thing. But Robert the doll is no less creepy here. This is a doll, which I'll try to describe. You can Google a picture, audience at home, but essentially is a doll that I can't tell if is made of wood or some kind of foam or maybe even like what they would used to make like mannequin busts out of here with holes all over its face. It has black beady eyes and a sailor's outfit on, which we'll come back to in a second here. He is holding a small dog in his hands, and well, he has some issues with people having issues with him, I guess. Let's just put it that way to get us started here. So supposedly, he has caused things such as car accidents, broken bones, job losses, divorces, and other problems as well. They, near as they can tell, and this is kind of fun because a different person actually went down the rabbit hole of finding the origin of this doll, which kudos to them because this just seems like it'd be a random lost to time thing. But apparently this doll is 117 years old. He is in Key West, Florida, and he is in a proud new display case, which was donated anonymously by someone who is, quote, a fan of Robert's, unquote. His new case has humidity control and also UV filtering glass to make sure he's preserved as well as possible. Despite the wonderful accommodations he now has, he is still cursing people that come into the museum. So the story of this doll starts, it says way back in 1994 for the most recent person here. And this is confusing because it was owned by a child named Robert Eugene Otto. And why it's confusing is, yes, both the boy and the doll have the same first name, Robert, but apparently the boy went by the name Gene. So this was a birthday gift from Otto's grandfather, who bought the doll on a trip to Germany and brought it back as a souvenir. And this doll, Robert, and the son, Gene, apparently had a relationship that carried on much too long for a normal child to have a doll as, like a best friend, more or less. Yeah, he was a little too old to still be having this. But essentially here, this is where it's kind of cool. The museum that he's at now in Key West managed to trace down where this doll came from, which is, if I say this wrong, the Steiff family, Steiff. And if it's German, I'm guessing this is some kind of pronunciation as such. Apparently, it's the same company they made the first teddy bear for Teddy Roosevelt, which is small world. But they said that they have no record of this ever being a product that they sold, even though they admit that it probably came from them. Their best guess is it was used as a window display piece once upon a time. And the way this one in particular is made, they said was never like released for commercial sale, more or less. When Gene was young, there would be problems that would happen. And of course, much like a good horror movie, he would blame some of these problems on the doll. And while the adults kind of assumed this was, a kid trying to get out of being in trouble or different things, they started to notice some odd things around the house, such as a house that Gene was staying in, which was nicknamed the artist house, apparently. And Robert would routinely be left upstairs and yet would be seen sometimes, mind you, not all the times, but sometimes staring out the window at the school children walking below on the sidewalk. They said that they would watch him from the sidewalk, and supposedly they claimed that he would appear, disappear, and reappear in the window when nobody was home. And when Gene died in 1974, a new person purchased the house, but left Robert upstairs, essentially in the attic, kind of to his own device. And visitors to the house would claim when they'd come over that they would hear footsteps running around in the attic and giggling coming from the attic as well. Some people even went so far as to claim that while watching the doll, Robert, his expression would change sometimes as people talked about his former owner, Gene, in a negative light. And then his countenance, his face would change essentially as for what they found. So the new owner had him at the house for 20 years and then finally donated him to his current museum. However, where this could have just been the end, find an old antique doll and send it to the museum and la-di-da, no one's the wiser. This is actually where Robert's story picks up in intensity as he becomes a display piece at this museum and people start to see him and his legend kind of grows because he's on display. People start to essentially, different reactions you might have to something supposedly spooky and haunted, which is, you might make a joke at its expense or you might, take it in jest or whatever the case may be. So he doesn't like to have his photo taken without permission is one thing, apparently. He has become so famous that apparently he has his own horror movie as well, which, I don't think that is as famous as the Annabelle movies, comparing our haunted dolls here. But there's that. You can get T-shirts and all sorts of things at the museum. And apparently they even have an option that you can pay to be locked with him in the room after dark, which is awesome.
That is a brilliant marketing strategy.
Right. So this one also says that he gets on average about 1 to 3 letters daily from fans. And I have just one here as well, similar to yours. It's not quite as sinister, but this is dated October 3rd, 2010. Dear Robert, I visited you a little over a month ago, and I never asked you if I could take your picture. And let me tell you, you've definitely made me regret that. The day after I returned home from Florida, a little less than a week after I visited you, I got my first speeding ticket, which ended up taking a month to get paid because they supposedly lost the ticket. And then I've been having problems after problem with my car. It's gotten to the point where it's not even logical to keep fixing it. So basically what I'm trying to say is that I'm sincerely sorry for not asking before I took your picture. That was very rude of me, and you definitely have made me learn my lesson. I hope to visit you again soon, and trust me, I will for sure ask before taking your picture. P.S. I'm so sorry. So this is but one of the letters that they've received in the mail for Robert, but he also has emails that come in. He also has presents that are left, apparently with peppermints and candy and all sorts of things as well. And the caretaker of the museum essentially will respond to some of these, I guess it says, as what do we want to say here? I don't know that she's posing as Robert, because that seems like it would probably not be in best interest of pissing him off, but it will answer some of these things that they receive. It says reading emails and letters, also running social media feeds, which I didn't check on that, but this is a social media feed you can take apparently. It does say once a year they can take him out of his case because they weigh him. That is checking for the humid Florida weather to see, because apparently his body is stuffed with straws, what's inside, it says. So they're basically checking if he's doing okay, I guess, getting his annual checkup. And let's see what else we have here. Oh my gosh, I don't even know. This is just, it says the caretaker, does the caretaker think that he is actually haunted? She said, I don't know. I really don't. I've never had a bad experience with him. I've never felt uncomfortable. It's always been a very basic relationship. I have a job to do and I go and do it. And whether there's something to it or not, he just allows me to get on with my job. So there you go. So this is a haunted doll, another haunted doll. This one's in Florida. Robert the doll. Oh, I didn't mention the sailor outfit. They figured that must have come from the kid when he was little.
Ugh.
Again, because the company said they essentially never made those clothes for a doll. So
Weird.
yeah.
I do feel a little bad or a little uneasy laughing about some of the stuff you said, considering your background image is a picture of Robert.
That's
So it's
true,
like, if you don't see me at the Halloween party, you know why.
right? Robert be watching.
All right. So my next one also involves children in a way. Collectively, it's known as the crying child paintings or the crying boy paintings. Crying boy is a little bit of a misnomer, but I'll get to that. Um, so these first made headlines in the UK in the 1980s, where a woman's house, caught fire, burned down, pretty much to the foundation. Everything was lost, just charred, blackened debris, except for one painting, which was a painting of a crying boy, which was the frame was a bit burnt, but otherwise the painting itself was completely untouched. Um, and which would have been kind of odd but unremarkable, except for when a tabloid newspaper looked to do a story about it. They got a quote from one of the firemen on the scene, who basically said, "Oh yeah, this isn't the first time we've seen this happen. I've worked plenty of other other fires where we've seen paintings like this that just that don't get burned."
Sure,
Um,
as one does.
as one does. Apparently, there was a strange popularity of paintings of crying children in the UK in the 80s and before.
But
Go figure. So the first one that came to light was in 1985. The headline that the Sun wrote about it was "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy." And basically they relayed what had happened and the quote from the fireman who was on the scene, and they started getting responses, like a lot of responses from other people who had paintings like this. They were mass produced, like department store paintings. You could go in, you could just buy a picture of a random crying kid for some reason, and they weren't all the same kid. Some of them weren't even boys. Some of them were girls. Some of them had multiple children, but they were all paintings of these weeping, depressed kids. Which that alone just strikes me as utterly bizarre. Like, I don't understand what would prompt
what a
really
weird,
anyone, let
yeah,
alone multiple people, to buy one of these for their home.
really, what a weird
Um,
item to have.
it is, yeah. But apparently they had so many responses saying that I've got one of these in my home. Should I be worried? That the news, the tabloid had basically said, okay, to keep yourself safe, send them to us and we'll destroy them. So they ended up with about 2,500 of these freaking things.
Whoa,
That yeah, that they I think, I don't remember if it was on TV or just they did it for their paper, but they put them all onto a pile and, go figure, they burned them, which doesn't make a lick of sense, but somehow that was able to destroy them.
hmm.
Um, but yeah, they made a huge like pile of them, had a bonfire, and they got rid of a lot of them. But more are apparently still out there and have been even back into the 1970s, possibly even into the 50s. Um, Now, this is where the story gets a little muddled, because the name that was signed on a lot of these paintings was Giovanni Bragolin, which is apparently a person who doesn't exist. Um, at one point, it was thought that maybe Bragolin was a pen name or a pseudonym for a different painter named, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this, but Francois Seville. But it turns out he doesn't exist either. At least no one's been able to find a definitive record of him. But both of those names may have also been pseudonyms of a different artist who I think was from Russia but emigrated to Spain. And his name was Bruno Amadeo. And this guy did exist, but whether he was the person involved in all of this, whether he painted all of them or just some of them or what, it's such a muddled string from point A to point C over here that it's hard to really say anything for certain. But the one thing that was known, that we can say with pretty much a high degree of certainty, is that this Amadeo guy did paint a lot of pictures of crying kids because there was a market somehow. Um, and they
Wow.
were sold, yeah, and I don't know, but they were sold from the 50s through the 70s in department stores all over England. Um, but there was also another artist who apparently cashed in on the this craze named Anna Zinkaisen, who was from Scotland. And in terms of like trying to find answers from them, they couldn't, because by the time this story exploded, they were both dead. So we're left with we are left with paintings that may have either been the cause of fires wherever they were put up, because a lot of homes burned down with these paintings in them and they remained untouched. It may have just been a coincidence. They may have been coated with some sort of flame resistance finish, but for just cheap department store paintings, who knows? An interesting thing, though, is more recently, and I believe as early as 20 or as recently as 2010, there was a comedian named Steve Punt who went on television, and he managed to get his hands on a copy of, or basically one of the surviving paintings of a crying child, and he decided to try to burn it on air just to show that, hey, this is stupid. I don't know what you people are thinking. And there are clips of this on YouTube, and it's interesting. So they set a bit of kindling at the base. They light it, and the flames start to creep up the frame, and they're burning a little bit, and then they just sort of go away,
Really?
leaving the painting itself untouched. It's kind of freaky. And yeah, you can find it on YouTube. Just search for like crying boy or crying child painting burned, and yeah, it's a like a 10-minute long segment or something. And yeah, the flames barely touch the painting itself. Whether that means it does have some sort of you know coating that keeps it from burning, or if there is something weird with these. uh, I'm leaning towards the former, but I don't know why they'd go through that kind of effort for something that was mass produced like this. But it also raises the question of, okay, if this was a single painting and it had some sort of tragic history, like maybe this kid died in a fire, maybe this kid,
Yeah.
maybe the painter, murdered the kid or something like that, and this is how he's getting his revenge. If it was a singular thing, that would be that would seem almost a little more sensible. But these are hundreds and hundreds, thousands at one point of these paintings that people were afraid were going to set their houses on fire. And different kids, different genders, different arrangements of them. And if this is an actual curse, it suggests that something about that subject matter is able to is able to spread a curse throughout copies of itself, almost like the ring, except not quite as hands-on. Um, so this one, just because of how many instances of the object there are, and how hard it is to track down anything solid about how they were made, or why so many houses had fires that had these things survive. It's just fascinating to me. I think the unlikely explanation that they were all treated with some sort of fire retardant is more believable than crying children are cursed by nature. But yeah, it's really interesting, the fact that one instance all of a sudden brought all these other instances to light and started a mania that lasted for a couple of years, where people were trying to get rid of these things as fast as they could. So yeah, it is one of the better known ones that I came across. So I wanted to throw in one that had a bit more notoriety to it. But yeah,
That's
it's
crazy.
bizarre. Yeah.
I don't think I've heard of that one before. I just watched the video in the background here while you were
Hmm.
chatting. I was checking out the comments here. I bought this painting when I was a teenager. I fell in love with that old colonial house we had in those days. I pasted it on the wall and loved looking at that boy. It made me feel a type of way I couldn't explain. The house never caught fire, but we built another one on the same property, and that house eventually fell into ruins. Years later, we went, and the portrait was still there on the wall, standing strong while everything else was falling apart. But
So
who
yeah,
knows from comments?
right, right. I mean, anything you see on the internet, take with a grain of salt. But this one's gotten a lot of notoriety. So
I do like this other person's comment. I'd just give it to my brother. He can break anything. Would probably make short work of this painting in less than 10 minutes.
uh,
Uh, wow, that's weird. Yeah, I mean, I guess they could have like coated the paintings in something, but I just can't imagine why they would have.
yeah, and you'd think if they did that for these types of paintings, they would have done it for any of the paintings that they sold at the stores,
Right.
you know? And you don't really hear about pictures of like a seascape surviving a fire and being cursed. So it's
Yeah.
bizarre.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting one. All right. Well, I have two left, and both of my two that are left share something in common, and that is the water level. So let's hear about these one at a time. Here's my next one for you, Justin. We're going to go back to your lovely land of Italy, not to talk about your cursed island, although I was double checking your list when you started yours, and I was like, wait, did we end up picking the same one even after you gave me your list? Like, did I fall into some curse here that I am headed with you to the Palazzo Dario, aka the horror house. This is a 500-year-old Venetian. We're in Venice, Italy. So when I made the water comment here, everything in Venice is basically underwater. So it is also known as Cadaro. And listen to this string of unlucky victims associated with this house. It's basically said that anyone who's ever owned the building or stayed there for more than 20 days died, committed murder, or became bankrupt. The local fishermen do not dare cast their ropes in the direction of the cursed Palazzo, which has been dubbed the house that kills. House was built in 1479. For the namesake here, this is an aristocrat named Giovanni Dario, and later on, his daughter, Marietta, and her husband, Vincenzo, inherited the house. Vincenzo, the husband, was stabbed to death, and Marietta died by suicide in the canal nearby. Their son, Vincenzo Jr., was later killed in Crete by assassins. Yes, that's a real sentence. Was killed in Crete by assassins. Okay, further on here. The cursed house claimed another victim when British scientist Radon Brown became its owner. He lived there for 4 years before suffering financial difficulties, and his romantic relationship with another man was discovered. This is a recurring thing we're going to have here. The scandal affected him so much that in 1842, he died by suicide in the palace with his partner, with some speculation that the deaths may have actually been a murder-suicide. Charles Briggs, an American millionaire, next had the house. He bought the palazzo and was accused of being gay before he fled to Mexico, where his lover died by suicide. We have no one living in the house for the first half of the 20th century before, in 1964, world-famous, not to me because I don't know this, world-famous operatic tenor Mario Delmonico entered negotiations to buy the property. However, on his way to Venice to sign the contract, he was involved in a serious car accident, and this guy made the right decision by reading the room and the omens and decided not to buy the building. So he lived. In the 1970s, the Count of Turin, Filippo Giordano della Lanze, bought this house before being murdered by his lover, Raoul Bleich, who later died a violent death after fleeing to London. Kit Lambert, famously the manager of the rock band The Who, bought the palace. However, he would often stay at a hotel nearby because he said he couldn't stay in the house due to the fact that there were too many ghosts that infested it, he said. In the 1980s, Venetian businessman Fabrizio Ferrari bought the house and moved there with his sister Nicoletta. He lost all of his assets, and his sister then died in a car crash. Later that same decade, financier Raul Gardini bought the place, hoping to give it to his daughter, but after a series of economic setbacks and scandal, he also committed suicide in 1993. At the turn of the 21st century, here comes yet another famous person, our most famous yet, Woody Allen. decided to buy the Palazzo Dario, but changed his mind after he read about all the strange and tragic deaths connected to the house. In 2002, The Who's original bass player, John Entwistle, suffered a heart attack after renting the place, only having been there a week. Locals believe the cause of the curse may be the fact that the building was supposedly, of course, who knows these things, was supposedly built over an old Templar cemetery. And if you look at the actual picture of the Palazzo Dario, it does have a tilt to it, as you know, a lot of buildings do in Venice. But they're speculating that because it was built on a cemetery, especially, it is weak foundation essentially, and it's tilted to the right. This is a building that you can see from both the front and the back if you were to go to Venice and take a look at it. It's a very pretty looking building. It's kind of plain and both exquisite at the same time. It's kind of a unique architecture style. But this is the house that kills the Palazzo Dario, and it has apparently claimed quite a few victims. So that was a fun one to stumble upon.
Neat. Yeah, that one I hadn't heard of before. But okay, I guess that brings me to my last one, which is the most recent. With it, this whole thing, I don't know the exact years, but within the past couple of years is when this whole thing developed. And it centers primarily, instead of multiple victims and all that, it centers primarily around one man. So I'm going to talk about the what I can only refer to as the curious case of Masaki Nakayama. Now, Nakayama is a manga artist, so he draws Japanese comics, for a living, primarily horror comics. His most famous work hasn't been translated into English, but it's called Fuan no Tane. It translates as something about paranoia, I think. But the work in question that kind of kicks off this whole potential curse is called PTSD Radio. Now, it's for the bulk of its run, it is really inventive, really experimental horror. If you haven't read it, it's hard to really describe, but the story really does capture the feel of like flipping back and forth between stations on a radio dial. Like you'll get a little snippet of one storyline, and then all of a sudden it'll cut to another, and then another. And at first they all seem disconnected, but as you read and you start to kind of connect the dots, you see that there is a through line for everything. And the first several volumes of this are just fantastic. Like some of the most creative and creepy ass horror I've read in a really long time. The short version of the story is it centers ultimately around an idol, like of a basically an icon of a god in a small village that has been kind of forgotten, ground under the wheels of time, and it's getting angry, and its malevolence is starting to like seep into the real world. Now, like I said, most of this series is really good. Then you get to the where it ends, at least for now. And I've got the last omnibus here, and like
Oh,
a third of this
don't
thing,
touch that.
a third of this thing is actually taken up with the author's accounts of what supposedly happened to him while he was writing it, where events from the story supposedly were starting to have parallels for him in real life. Now, it starts with it seems like his issues started when he moved from Tokyo to Sapporo, a different part of Japan, further north, cheaper cost of living, and he basically he moved his studio, from Tokyo over to there, and that's where the problems began. The building he moved into was 4 stories tall, and aside from himself, one other business that was closed at nights, and the landlord who was there sometimes, it was vacant. He got the office space for what I gather is like a dirt cheap rate, and pretty much as soon as he moved in, weird stuff started happening. Like he'd hear noises where no one else was supposed to be around. The lights would, behave weirdly. Odd smells would just appear out of nowhere and linger. Um, and in setting things up in one of the closets, he discovered a package that he says he didn't open, but it was tattered. It was wrapped in like oilcloth, and it's from what he could see poking out of the holes in it because it was in really bad shape. It looked like someone had taken like a family shrine, a family altar that you see in a lot of Japanese homes, and just smashed the hell out of it and wrapped it up in this package, shoved it into a closet, and forgot about it. He tried to forget about it too, but it well, whether this was the cause of what happened to him or not, it's definitely something that he took note of. Um, but as he was working on the story, there's a part where it's hard to really describe, but there are these things that kind of either infect people or come out of them as a result of something they've done. And there's a sequence where someone basically vomits up blood. Um, this happened to him at one point, to the point where he goes to the hospital and he's like, "Well, what the hell is wrong with me?" So they go through a bunch of tests and they say, okay, well, the best we can figure is you got this condition, which I'm probably going to butcher the name of, but I will do my best. ITP, or idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, which is apparently something that is very rare, hard to diagnose, but given his symptoms, they think that's what he had, where basically it causes your body's immune system to attack your platelets. So it destroyed his blood's ability to clot.
Okay.
So all the blisters, because he was getting these horrible like black blisters in his mouth that would burst and like ooze blood into his mouth. They think those were caused by subcutaneous, just bleeds that normally a regular body would stop, but his couldn't anymore. Um, According to him, the doctors told him that a normal person's platelet count per whatever unit that they use to measure is between 127 and 356. His was 2. So he
Oh,
essentially had no ability to clot his own blood. Um, that led to extensive hospital stays, and treatments and whatnot, to where he was eventually feeling okay enough to start work on the story again. But as time went on and as he kept working, he had it wasn't just him that was having issues. He would have workers who would quit with no reason given, just like up out of nowhere. People he had worked with for years, just sorry, I can't do this anymore, gone. He had other health issues of a similar nature that cropped up, but he also had ran into more bizarre things that he's frustratingly vague on. Like he talks at one point about how he decided to poke around in one of the abandoned other offices just to see if there's something wrong with them, why no one had moved in. And he mentions this like pitch black hole in the floor that apparently one of his assistants looked into and then just disappeared, like not into the hole, but she left work that day and never showed back up again. No
Jesus.
calls, no voicemails, no nothing. As far as I can tell, to this day, he's never heard from her again. Um, and just this on and on, things like that kept, supposedly kept happening, to the point where he stopped. Let's see, da-da-da. We have one more page marked here, where at the very end he finishes the collection saying that basically, look, things have gotten worse. There's still stuff I can't talk about. But I had more health issues. Like my entire face swelled up at one point to the point where I could barely breathe. No explanation for that. But ultimately, he alludes to some event that he refuses to talk about because whatever entity or force or something that he says is involved with it refuses to let him say any more. If he does, something even worse will happen. So he ends the collection basically saying, "This will likely really be the last time I talk about this subject. I'd rather not have to go through any more trauma like this, so I've decided to stall, or rather, abandon any further inquiry altogether. Thank you for understanding." Now, there are two obvious possible explanations for this. A, he moved into a cursed building, upset something very powerful that really didn't want him to continue writing what he was writing, and to save his own life, he has stopped doing that and acquiesced to this entity's wishes. Or, and here's what I think happened. He wrote himself into a corner. And I don't mean to be uncharitable. I mean, there is a chance. There's every chance that he has had the health issues he says he's had,
Yeah.
but I have no way of verifying that. Like, even in the U.S., a person's medical records aren't public knowledge, so I can't. And even if I read Japanese better than I actually do, I'm sure I wouldn't be able to really make any headway to dig up concrete accounts of what happened to him, or what he says happened anyway. But that aside, I really think the more plausible explanation is he had this fantastic start to a horror series, and he ran with it as long as he could, and then wasn't sure where else to go with it. So rather than write something unsatisfying and that would just let his fans down, he decided to go with a gamble and try to make it just a really creative, marketing push, saying that, hey, I'd like to continue saying, the story to the end, but it's too dangerous, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, it worked to some extent. I read it because after I picked up the first volume, I heard about the supposed curse revolving around Nakayama, and it's like, well, I have to see where the story goes from here. So from a
Right.
marketing angle, it's kind of brilliant, if that is the case. And I do think it is, but in the offhand chance that he did encounter something far beyond his experience, far beyond his ability to cope with, my heart goes out to the guy, because if you're bleeding because your body won't let you stop bleeding, that's horrible. So that's the curious case of Masaki Nakayama.
Wow. I hadn't heard of that one before. I was checking out some of the art while you were talking about that one. I mean, there's some truly twisted imagery here.
Yeah, the
So,
guy is a fantastic artist. And apparently he is still writing his other series. I hope that gets translated to English at some point, because I'd like to see, a story that actually keeps going and that doesn't just stop midway through.
yeah, I mean, some of the stuff just looks like creepypasta stuff here. I'm getting all kinds of vibes of similar type feel to it. That's for sure. Okay, well, that's a creepy one. Boy, it does make you wonder though. I was thinking that I was like, is this just publicity? Like he's trying to sell copies of this or not? Probably, but if not, wow,
Yeah.
that's some crazy stuff. And the fun thing about our world is if anybody had something like this happen to them, nobody would ever believe them,
Yeah.
So like you'd be safe saying it because people would be like, oh yeah.
Yeah. It's the weird irony of it all.
All right. Well, my last one here tonight, as I mentioned, also has to do with water levels. In this case, much like the Venetians who foolishly tried to build a city on water, this one has to do with a city that apparently thought it was a good idea to build a city under the water level. So that's where we're at here as I talk about my final one, which is Nicolas Cage. Sort of,
Go on.
but actually sort of. So for my last one, we are traveling down to New Orleans, where I actually visited this summer. So this is a fun one because I just actually saw some of this stuff myself. But I am here to talk about the story of Madame Lalaurie, who is a icon in New Orleans, but for all the wrong reasons. So, first of all, if anybody out there listening is a fan of the American Horror Story seasons, you may have remembered in season 3 where they do the witches and they have the Coven's the name of the season. They have several houses and destinations, which were, I don't know if they were portrayed in New Orleans, I forget, but they were filmed in New Orleans of some of these. But one of the characters in the TV show is played by Kathy Bates, and that is a real life person who did live, whose name is Madame La Laurie. I guess is maybe how you pronounce it here. And yeah, I wasn't actually joking, audience, when I said this story does involve Nicolas Cage, which is just the most fantastic thing ever. So we did several tours while we were down there, and one of the fun stories, well, for us to listen to, although not historically fun stories, is there was a rich family down in New Orleans by the name of the La Lauries, and there was a madam, just like the one played by Kathy Bates, who had a fairly sizable house in downtown New Orleans, down in the French Quarter, and we were able to stop and take some photos and look around that a little bit on the outside, not on the inside, of course. But this is interesting because this real life woman held a secret in her very large house, which was in the middle of the house. There was essentially a secret chamber where, unbeknownst to the public, she was doing some pretty vile and heinous things, which I will get back to in just a second. At one point, the La Lauries are hosting a pretty fashionable party because they were, socialites in the town. And during this party, there is some sort of occurrence that takes place. Now, I should mention that her husband had already left her by this point. She and he fought a lot, and she was living by herself as like the madam of the house in New Orleans, who was kind of running everything there. And apparently she was taking out the frustration of her marriage in other ways, which again, I'll get back to in just a second here. At some point, there was a party that was happening, as mentioned, and while this was happening, and there's speculation that it may have been a black servant who maybe purposefully started the fire so that when the fire people would arrive, they would find the secret to this house and the Madame La Laurie. So while people were being evacuated from the house, as this fire is breaking out, they're going through the house as firemen typically would, making sure everybody's cleared out of the house. All the party guests are leaving. All the staff is leaving as they're coming out. Well, the firemen go in and, it's summarizing here. One of them comes out and, kind of was like, oh my God, you wouldn't believe what we just found in this house. So the real life Madame La Laurie apparently had a horror chamber that was a windowless room in the middle of her house someplace, where she was essentially committing atrocities to black citizens in New Orleans at the time, former freed slaves, because there were a lot of freed slaves at that point in New Orleans. But it says here, some experiments that they believe she was doing on them include breaking their bones to try to reset them in different positions, drilling holes into their heads to see what would happen, and covering their bodies with honey and then putting ants on them to let them, But this was all discovered because the firemen went into this room for the first time, and this is where they found bodies hanging from the ceiling, bodies lying on the ground. I mean, some people were in a state of decompose, other people were still barely alive when they got in there, but this is like fairly documented actual things that happened in the city of New Orleans. And side note to all of this, and where her in the flesh part of this story ends, is that while the fire's taking place and there's all this chaos and commotion, she apparently, according to one of the tour guides we saw, now I'm not basing this all off what the tour guides told us, because take that with a grain of salt, but the tour guide had told us that as this house is on fire, she was basically like, oh, no, like, don't let this little fire, like, stop the party. So she was encouraging people to, like, take couches and chairs out onto the cobblestone street and, like, continue to drink out there and stuff while this is all happening. Well, come to find out, what she was really doing was causing as much of a possible scene as she could, because she was hastily making her escape out of the city of New Orleans while this is all happening. And later, they find her in, I believe, Paris. She made it to France, and that's where she ultimately dies. So her story ends there. But the house is still there. Now, a house that has suffered this much trauma has fallen into the cursed house territory at this point. So this is where we now get to various owners have had this house throughout its time, and they have all reported terrible, terrible things there. Claiming that it was as simple as a haunting that was taking place in the house. Other people have claimed that they've heard moans coming from inside the house, cries, footsteps, screams. One of the landlords was apparently found brutally murdered in his room in the house with no explanation. And later on, a person said that the landlord claimed he had been haunted by what he referred to as a, quote, demon while he was living there. So the house picks up more of a reputation. It's now known as the Haunted House on Royal Street. And as mentioned, the house basically went owner to owner to owner to owner because no one wanted to keep the damn thing for too long. But it was also kind of a landmark type place with some history, dark as it may be. It's a, good touristy spot if you're taking a tour of New Orleans to hear some of these tales. And so there's probably some economics to the place. Plus, some people, as it turns out, are just really fascinated by haunted houses. And this is where we get to our friend Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage buys not one, but two haunted houses in New Orleans because he, quote, collects haunted houses, unquote. He's fascinated with these things. He buys the La Laurie mansion because he believes that it's going to somehow inspire him to write the next great American horror novel, which sounds both like, the most Nicolas Cage thing you can possibly imagine, and also like, how dumb are you at the same time, which is also the most Nicolas Cage thing you can imagine. Now, he apparently owns haunted houses across the country, which I was not aware of, and he spent precisely one night in this house after purchasing it. He leaves because he said there is just too much going on here. Sounds, disruptions, he's hearing the moans, he's hearing all the advertised features for the house. The Redfin listing on this one was pretty accurate when they were disclosing everything, and he got everything he wanted, so much so that he lasted one night. So the second night he has this property, he rents the place across the street from the house, but tells his friends to have a party in the house while he watches from across the street. So this is kind of intriguing, but he eventually loses his house. Now, it's believed that this house is cursed, and I don't have the long string of them here, but I do think they made some mention while we were in New Orleans, much like this murder house in Italy, that there's basically tragedy that befalls anyone who owns this property, and they basically try to offload it as soon as they can to the next poor sucker who wants to buy a haunted house, and then they haven't for so long, and then they try to get rid of it. Well, Nicolas Cage had a curse put on him by this house in the spirits of the people that had this house, and probably you could extrapolate that maybe this curse has jumped and attached onto him because he was trying to profit essentially off of what this house was and the history that was there. Shortly after this, if you were to follow Nicolas Cage's career path in Hollywood, you will also see that it starts to dive. And what happens here is Nicolas Cage actually, career goes downhill and he goes bankrupt about the same time. And so there might have been some really terrible movies in the aughts or somewhere around there where you're like, wow, I can't even believe Nicolas Cage would take that role. It's because he was so far in debt, he needed any money he could possibly get. The house is eventually purchased by, it says here, a rich businessman from Texas. I don't know if that is there. It does say it's unavailable. Now, interestingly, the night we were there, similar to your author you were just talking about, our tour guide, who definitely knew his stuff on the tour route, was telling us that, this is the house that are here. It's on the corner. He's telling us all these stories. And he's like, there's somebody that owns this. They live out of state and basically the house is used for nothing. I think he comes by like 5 times a year to check on it type deal. Interestingly, on the night we were there, there was a light on inside the house on like the third story. And he was like, that's super weird. Like there's never any lights on in this house, period. And then we went like around the corner and it almost seemed as though there was like some kind of get together happening at the house. So our tour guide like didn't try to oversell that. Basically was like, I don't really know what's going on because like this place is always empty when we do these tours, which could have been a little, scare tactic type thing too. But back to our friend Nicolas Cage, because our story's not over yet. Oh, no, my friend. Nicolas Cage is trying to get rid of this curse that's on him, which is making his Hollywood movies go downhill, his personal life hell, his fortunes are all ruined, and he's trying to do anything he can about this. Well, one of the spots I most wanted to visit while I was in New Orleans is a place called St. Louis Cemetery Number 1, which is the first and oldest of the Catholic cemeteries in New Orleans. They made very sure to tell you while you were there that New Orleans is older than the United States itself. It's an old city. But one cemetery gravestone does not quite look the same as the rest in this St. Louis Cemetery Number 1. And that is because if on your end, Justin, you're interested, you can Google Nicolas Cage tombstone. And what you will see is a very large pyramid-shaped white obelisk here with some very ancient-looking graves around it. This is because Nicolas Cage was trying to, again, remove this curse in any way he could, and he wanted land desperately in this particular cemetery, which told him, no, you can't have any land in here because, like, it's old. I think they said at the time there were only 8 plots left in the cemetery, and Nicolas Cage essentially worked some Hollywood magic / some financial might, and I believe managed to not only get 1 lot, but actually 2 next to each other by possibly having someone else's remains moved.
Oh, geez.
I believe that was with permission from the family, though, based on what he was paying them. But essentially he buys a double lot so he can put this giant gaudy white pyramid in there. Now, there is a second pyramid-shaped tombstone in the cemetery right when you walk in, but it is nowhere near as chiseled as this thing is looking, flexing all of its land here. But the interesting thing here is not that he just wanted to buy land in this particular cemetery for a tombstone that he hopes he'll never have to use. He just wanted his aura to be basically in this tombstone, in this cemetery, not because of Nicolas Cage and not because of Madame Lalaurie, but because of the third person in this tale, and that is the voodoo queen, Marie Laveau. She is buried about 200 feet from him in this cemetery. Now, Marie Laveau, they claim in New Orleans, is the second most visited gravesite in America. I don't know if that is true or not. That would be pretty hard to substantiate, especially with presidents and other things, I would think. Mm-hmm. But she is basically the icon of the city, practicing voodoo queen, as it were. And unlike most of the reputation of voodoo, she practiced white magic, which was a healing or cleansing spirit. And it is believed that if there is anyone in the city or the country who could cleanse this curse off of him, it is her from the afterlife. Nicolas Cage has paid modern day voodoo practitioners as well as Catholic, what am I thinking of here? Spirits.
Exorcists.
There you go. Thank you. Exorcists. He's tried all these different people, but basically all of the voodoo practitioners said you're going to need someone who is more powerful than anybody who's left alive at this point in their religion. And the only one they could think of was her. And of course, she's been gone for a long time. But I think essentially he's saying maybe there was some black voodoo happening in this chamber in the house. So this is the way to counteract that. But yes, so her cemetery gravestone is about 200 feet, give or take, away from his. And that's kind of the idea here. She was another person, it says here, on a day in 1874, she went to perform a religious rite on the shores of Lake Pontchartrain, which is the big lake in New Orleans. That witnessing of her doing her rite alone attracted 12,000 people. So she had quite, a sway with her audience. That was in 1874. So 12,000 people
Wow.
back then is even more impressive.
Yeah.
Crazy stuff here. So she was, like I said, a white practitioner, also a Roman Catholic as well, and also went to Catholic Church. So she was just a really holy person. So that is how we end up with the cursed house, which is still sitting there. We end up with Nicolas Cage believing in this curse, enough so that he buys a double lot giant white pyramid gravestone. And we also end up with perhaps the spirit of Marie Laveau willing to maybe help Nicolas Cage from the afterlife. So that is my last curse story for the evening.
Wow. That's a hell of a one to end on. I mean,
Yeah.
holy crap. That's that's interesting. I had not heard that story before, but I love that. It has so many elements that seem so outlandish, but at least some of them are things we can verify as having happened.
Yeah.
And
We
yeah,
can all safely say Nicolas Cage has had a terrible career.
yeah, yeah.
We can definitely say that. Beyond that, who knows? But yeah, okay, sweet. I mean, I don't know if we can do a rating on this. Do you want to just leave it as is, or do you want to give me a like, do you believe in curses type thing? I don't know.
I,
I'm okay with leaving it, I think.
I am too.
Okay.
I mean, I've put my thoughts out about certain individual ones we've talked about, but overall, yeah, I think we can leave the rest as is.
Yeah. I will say 10 out of 10 that Cinemasters curses anyone who has played it with Joe.
11.
Yeah, no doubt. All of the Jaws sequels, so 11.
uh,
Or should we say it's about 10? All right, let's move on from there and go with that.
uh,
So, all right, well, that was a fun one, everybody, to kick off our Spooktober as we're
yeah,
returning here. We'll try to squeeze a couple more creepy episodes in here during the
yeah.
month, and we'll see what else we get to. So, till then, I guess we have nothing else. This has been Cody.
And Justin?
And we'll see you all next time on the Fun Podcast. Friends occasionally not disagreeing. We will leave here today in singing our song with our best cursed voice and or Nicolas Cage. Your choice.
All
All right,
right.
everybody. Take care. We'll see you next time on Friends. Or occasionally.
Occasionally.
We're not disagreeing. Like,
Let's
not disagreeing.
disagree.
There we go. All right.
Yeah.
No. What? Okay.
That's high praise.
Yeah, that's high praise. You're right. Yeah. All right. Bye, everybody.
uh,